Good morning. Turn to the book of Daniel, chapter 1. Just for the record, you'd think after all these years of doing daylight saving time, I could get it right just one time. I'm beginning to wonder if I'll ever get it right. So you might not want to stand very close to me this morning if you're going to have a conversation with me. I'm just saying. Today we're looking in the book of Daniel. We are not doing an exegesis of verse-by-verse exegesis because we'd be here for the next week of it. So we're going to look at just a few verses that'll help us grab a hold of what was going on in this particular book and with this particular prophet. And while we're not looking at his prophecies today, we're looking at it in a very different way. In that we're looking at his life in relationship to being dropped into a culture that was anti-Christ, anti-God, that did not value the things that God valued, and how they remained faithful in the middle of that. So the sermon title today is, How Do We Remain Faithful in a Faithless World? How do we remain faithful in a faithless world? And I want to give you just a little teaser towards the end, and I'm going to read for you from Daniel chapter 2, verse 47. It says this, that the king answered Daniel. This is after several things had happened. The king answered Daniel and said, Surely your God is the God of gods, and the Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries. And since you have been able to reveal this mystery, the mystery he's referring to is an interpretation that Daniel was able to do for this king that was actually threatening the lives of everybody else, but all the other people who were supposed to be able to interpret the dreams. But I get ahead of myself, except that I want you to sort of, in the back of your mind, remember this. Not only did Daniel discover a way to live faithful in a faithless world, he discovered how to do it in such a way that the very king that had carried Israel off into bondage now was saying, your God is the God of all gods. And this was a man who worshiped many pagan gods and even counted himself as a god, and we'll hear about that just a little bit later on. So how do we remain faithful in a faithless world? What you see as you begin chapter 1 is this, in the first couple 3 verses, that one, the nation of Israel had been taken into bondage because of their incredible obedience. Now, if you haven't been with us here before, their incredible disobedience. If you haven't been with us in this series so far of being in exile and dealing with the issues of being a follower of God, a follower of Christ in a world that doesn't particularly care for the way that you're choosing to do life, your vision for life, your moral standards in life, and how Israel became very disobedient, and God called them into into captivity. Well, he did call them to some activity too, in my defense. But right now they're being made captive. And so because of their own disobedience, they've been pulled off into captivity. They're taken into bondage. It's interesting, in verse 2 it talks about how that the goblets from the temple, all the treasured elements of worship that were a part of what was going on there at the temple was taken with them, and they were actually put in the treasury of this pagan king and the pagan gods that he worshipped, and they were there for just his little pleasure. And while we won't have time to go into it today, later on they start to mock God by using those in a very particular way in their pagan worship. And then verse 3 and 4, what you see is the whole nation of Israel is picked up, carried away, and they're dropped in the middle of a culture that did not buy their God, did not buy their morality, did not support what they said, and they literally were under the rule of these pagan people. Now, one of the reasons I like going to restaurants is because I hear the bizarre ideas of how people think about our world today. And depending on which side of political things they fall on and which side of religious views they fall on, there's some pretty strange views out there. But a lot of people just hate government, period. It doesn't matter what version you are. And so they have this idea that we've been intruded upon. So whether you're kind of in the government-hating mode today, or you're scared to death of this world and its influence on yourself, your children, and all that, and you just shake your head every day when you watch the news, you know a lot what it was like for Israel during that time. I'd like to suggest to you that there are a lot of believers in our world today that are in the same place, that they have been taken into bondage by their own disobedience, and they've been carried off, and they now find themselves in a culture that's eating them alive. And so this morning, I'm attempting to be very practical in this way. I believe that there are some keys that are very important to being able to live faithful in a faithless world. Matter of fact, I think those keys to living faithful in a faithless world leave an indelible impact to unlock the mysteries for the rest of the world about what real life is like. Now, I'm going to repeat that. I believe that there are keys to living faithfully in this faithless world. And if I will take advantage of those keys, by default, naturally, there'll be an impact on the culture in which I live that will leave a mark on them that can never be taken away. Now, when I was a kid, this is probably going to shock a few of you, I played G.I. Joe. But I'm not talking about those flimsy little dolly kind of Barbie wannabe things, okay? I'm not talking. We played real G.I. Joe. BB guns and rocks. And so we divided up our teams. We'd make camo out of our stuff, paint camouflage on us, and we'd shoot each other with BB guns and throw rocks. And we had rules, though. The rules were you couldn't shoot each other in the eye. Of course, this wasn't the eye. It never occurred to us that one of us might have a bad aim. And the rocks, you had to use river rocks that were smooth, because the ones that had edges on them, when you threw them, they would cut you. Mom didn't really like that much. And so, but we had this really cool set of things we would do. And we had, like, forts we would have to conquer. And there was this one deal we had where you had a secret game. So we would take a key, much like the one that we had up there earlier. We were talking about the keys to faithfulness. And we would take, the deal was, is you had a key. And you had to make an imprint of that key in Play-Doh that we stole from our little brothers and sisters. And then you had to melt wax and make your own key. And that would get you into the other person's cave or their fort. But it had to be the exact key. So you had to not capture the key because you didn't want to let them know that you already had their key. So you had to go make an impression of the key, then put the wax in. I know it's sick. And then, of course, we would blow them up and throw rocks at them. It was great. It was a lot of fun. But that was G.I. Joe. Well, I want you to bear that in mind, not because it is particularly spiritual at all, but I do want you to keep that image in mind, that there are keys that make impression on our culture. But first of all, the keys that we're going to talk about are the things that I'm telling you that will help you remain faithful in the place that you are in your walk with Christ. Now, let me just be perfectly clear. If you ignore what I'm saying this morning as we look at the life of Daniel, you are probably not going to remain faithful. I repeat, I know what I'm talking about this morning, not because I'm smart, but because we have a real-life living guy who was living in the middle of a culture that supported none of his morality, none of his views about how to do life, and he not only remained faithful, he made a dramatic impact on the culture that he was living in. So if you ignore these keys, you are likely to end up in a place where you do not remain faithful. So let's look at those keys together. We're going to move through them quickly. Excuse me. The first key is this, and you find it in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. It says this, "But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice of food or the wine which he drank." Now, there was a whole series, and I'm not going to go into discussions, but basically they've been brought into bondage, and the King Nebuchadnezzar decided, I'm going to give these guys the best of the best, so they'll be the smartest and the strongest, and he put them in a 3-year training program. Excuse me. But right off the bat, this guy Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, said, we have made up our mind we are not going to indulge in those things that this culture has to offer. They saw it somehow as going too far in terms of how they would do life. So the first key to remaining faithful is, first of all, to make up your mind. You say, well, duh, Tim. But I want you to hear this. If you do not decide where you're going to go, when anything comes up that rocks you a little bit, if you haven't already settled in your mind, this is how I'm going to do life, then anything that comes along that seems appealing, you'll just fall. You'll just fall. Another relationship comes along, you just fall. another opportunity to do this or that, or another opportunity to just fudge a little bit on what I know Christ has called me to. The bottom line is these guys settled in their mind before the pressure ever came. So when the pressure did start coming for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they'd already settled in their mind whose they were, and Paul calls it like this. He says you should guard your mind. James says this, a man who's not made up his mind and is not full of faith that he's going to trust God is like a wave that gets tossed back to and fro. Excuse me. Now, that's the first key, is make up your mind. If you're sitting here this morning and you kind of been doing it like this, you know, I kind of feel like I'm probably going to make my mom and dad happy if I come to church, or, you know, my wife really kind of likes it, and so that's good, or my husband really kind of likes it, so I'm going to go with that. You need to settle this morning on, are you going to walk with Christ or not? And it's really interesting because in the book of Revelation, Jesus himself says to one of the churches, I'd rather you be hot or cold, not lukewarm. In other words, make up your mind. Are you going to do this thing or not? Are you? I'm asking you, are you? You see, here's the thing that we miss, is there's an impact when we make up our mind about how we're going to do life long before the onslaught of what's coming comes, and it just sort of knocks me over like a wave. There's an impact that I can have on my world because I've decided to make up my mind. People in the world do not respect people that can't decide. How many jokes are made about people who are big weenies who will not decide anything? They just go from one thing to the other and one thing to the other. People don't respect that. If you want to make an impact on this world, even though I recognize you're going to take some hits if you make up your mind to follow Christ, people in this world see it as weak if you cannot make up your mind. The scriptures teach us this, that Jesus knew who he was and what he was to do and where he was going. And yes, he was rejected. But there's another thing that people thought about him. Many saw him, and I'm quoting, as one who had authority when he spoke. I'm not talking about being arrogant. I'm talking about being grounded and consistent, not distracted by all the things in the world. Quickly, I'd use this example. I am working so hard to learn tech things. And it's not that I can't do them, but here's my problem. I really like everything tech. So if you want to teach me anything tech that you think I don't know, come on. I'll be happy to drive you mad trying to teach me what it is. But here's the thing that happens. I get so enamored in it. How many of you have found yourself on the computer for 4 hours searching out something that you just couldn't put down? Anybody? Oh, yeah. Or you just couldn't put down Facebook or whatever it is. And what I want you to see is this, is that there are things that this world, I haven't got a thing in the world against tech, but there are things in this world that present themselves all the time, and they're not even necessarily bad things. They're things that distract me from the things that are a priority in my life. Things like this, that I'll trust Christ other than people, that I'll be present in people's lives. One of the hardest things that I have is that I have so many things I want to accomplish because I'm kind of project-driven, that you need to really pray for help besides me if you come in the middle of one of my projects. Because I'm not going to stop in the middle of that thing to help you because I'm going to finish my project. Wouldn't it be a countercultural thing if people experienced you someday putting down your phone and actually looking at them when you had a conversation with them? I know that's radical. That you just be present in people's life. Well, the reason I'm asking you to make up your mind is if I make a determination that I'm going to be present in people's life, it's going to make me review how I do all of how I look at life. I can have an impact on the world. The second key, excuse me, is this. And it's seen in Daniel chapter 1, verse 12. Daniel says, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and to drink and water to drink. And as the story goes, they were supposed to eat all this fine food and drink the wine, and they were supposed to be really, really strong as a result of that. Because they'd already made up their mind, as soon as they made up their mind, there came an opportunity then for them to say, I'm going to live my life this way. And so he went to the guy that was in charge of feeding them and said, look, I want you to just give us the basic stuff, and after 10 days, if we're not stronger than the others, you can take us out. It'll be on us. In other words, they put themselves in a place and they made a statement in front of everybody, so to speak, that says this: I am going to choose to do something where my God has to show up. And so the second key is sort of to run a flag up the pole and to say, hello, world. And I don't mean it in an arrogant way and in a way that says I'm better than you, but sort of out yourself, so to speak. Out yourself and say, I'm going to trust God for this in life, whether it's my finance or my relationships or whatever else it is, to where if you don't, you end up embarrassed. And it's now on God as you trust Him to demonstrate Himself in a mighty way. Now, as the story goes in Daniel, these guys were not only stronger, but over a period of time, they proved 10 times smarter and wiser and stronger than the other fellows who were eating the fine foods and supposedly had the best of the best. Excuse me. After I make up my mind, an opportunity will come not far behind for me to be tested. And as Fred and I were talking about this week, the whole idea is I'm running a flag up a pole. I'm saying, okay, world, here I am. Not with my arrogance, not with my voice, but with my decision making. Well, how does that help? Well, I'm telling you that Satan likes to work in secret. And I'm asking you to bring things out in the open so you can stand and have to depend on the Lord. Because when you bring things out in the light, it begins to stir up in you a desire for holiness. Excuse me. What impact would that have on our world? Daniel and his friends were the names of people that their names were actually a derivative of the god Baal that they worship. They had been required, some suggest that they'd even been required to become eunuchs so they wouldn't defile the king's marriages. So they were engulfed or immersed in this particular culture. But they now had started to become bold in their statements and not be blended in the culture that they found themselves. Excuse me. They made a bold statement that was countercultural. They trusted God's provision. And what had ended up happening was an amazing thing. God did incredible things in them as they were trusting Him, and people started to notice. They were in this world, but not of it, which is exactly what we're called to in the New Testament. There are many expressions that we have to, we are immersed in a culture today that calls us to be something other than what Christ has called us to. And I'm calling you to a countercultural way of living. And your faithfulness will draw the interest of other people. I'm not saying everybody's going to like it. I'm not even saying that you're not going to be in a place where you might not be criticized. But my stability in hard times will draw attention. I don't have to be blended to have an impact. As a matter of fact, I have an impact in this culture because of a beautiful thing. Every single time I go to a restaurant right now, and I'm not making this up, somebody wants to start a conversation about some controversial issue, and somewhere along the line, this is said. Well, you know, you can have your opinion, I can have mine, but could we talk about this more? I'm really interested to know what you have to say. This is the best environment in the world to have a conversation about where you're at with your faith. Are you hearing me? You get what I'm saying? It's not hard to have conversations because people want to know what people think. Now, I'm not saying they're going to like it when you get there. I'm just saying that people are interested in why you're being so bold but yet not remaining blended. We can have an impact on our world. Excuse me. Another key is this, that, and it's seen in Daniel chapter 2, 1 through 49, although we're not looking at those verses. If I expect to remain faithful, I must remain in community and not like some lone commando. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 17, we read this. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, about the matter, so that they might request compassion from the God of heaven. The king had his dream, and he was worried about it, and he forgot what the dream was. Has that ever happened to you? Except now he's worried that he's in trouble, so he calls his magicians and all these guys that are supposed to be able to tell him the interpreted dreams, and he says, you guys tell me the dream. And they said, we can't tell you, you tell us the dream. And he says, I don't remember. And they said, well, how are we supposed to tell you if you don't remember? And he says, I think you guys are doing a dance. You're supposed to be all wise and supposed to be all powerful and supposed to be powered by this god Baal. You're trying to trick me so I don't kill you. So here's the deal. You don't tell me what my dream is, and then you don't tell me what the interpretation is. You are going to die. So he's ready to kill everybody. Daniel hears about it. He asks about it. And then, before he does one more thing, he goes back to his buds and says, let's pray. Let's ask God for wisdom for this interpretation. This wasn't the only time that it happened in this fellow's life, by the way. Excuse me. Again and again and again, you see Daniel going back with his friendships. In chapter 2, verses 48 and 49, he surrounds himself with other wise men of faith after another big incident had happened, and he calls them in. And what happens is we see this consistent way that Daniel, who's living in a culture that does not support him, that does not agree with what he does, and he says, I need you around me to remind me what the truth is. I need you around me to remind me that I need to trust the living God. I need you around me to recognize and remember that I have a God that'll give me wisdom. He'll actually tell me what to do. And that's exactly what happened. But the whole thing was contingent on this guy's whole life living in the middle of a culture that did not support where he was at, was that he got together with people in community. So, I want you to listen very carefully. I recognize there are several opportunities for community here at Tri-State. Community is when you get together with people, you talk about what God's Word says about life, you talk about where I am in relationship to that and how I'm struggling. That's community. Watch my lips. If you refuse to be involved in community in some way, and that's some kind of connection with other believers where you can find yourself involved in the processes that Daniel found himself in, I'm telling you that I believe that you will struggle with remaining faithful. You say, well, Tim, I don't go to your community groups. Well, fine. My question for you is, let's get real. Are you involved in any kind of community? Or are you, like a lot of people, you walk in on Sunday morning, you enjoy the service, you say hi to a couple people, and bam, and you never have another conversation about God, His relationship with you, and really put yourself in connection, even one-on-one with one other believer the whole rest of your life. I'm telling you, I love you, I care about you, I'm not trying to judge you and be condescending towards you, but you are putting yourself at risk in terms of whether or not you can remain faithful. And it's time for that, you missing that key in life to end. It's a place where you can get spiritual insight, like Daniel's guys did, where you can get spiritual power to trust God, because sometimes the weight of what goes on in this culture and living in this culture is just too difficult. Sometimes Satan gets, his biggest trick is to get you all alone and to get you doing everything in the dark by yourself, living like a lone commando. But what impact can community have on this world? Well, community creates consistency in you and a confidence that, yes, I am still on the right track. Everything I've been hearing for this last week and month and maybe months about that there's another way to do life is not the way. And the world sees that sense of confidence about this thing that you've made up your mind about. But also, as I share what happens in community, especially during hard times, it has an appeal to people looking from the outside world. You want to know another big buzz thing in our culture today? Everybody's talking about being connected and having community. Am I right about this? I mean, I can name show after show after show on TV that what they celebrate is the community of whatever community they're putting together. This is an excellent time for you to say, I've got community and this place is my place of stability. And to say, I am going to do this and I purpose to do this. Why don't you come on with me? Because here's the things community has done for me. Excuse me, and what God has done in my life as a part of it. You need community. Another key in terms of remaining faithful is this, is that I'll be realistic and not just reactive. Realistic and not reactive. The event, it starts in chapter 3 and verse 1 and following. Nebuchadnezzar made this huge statue. And everybody was supposed to bow down to it. And here's the funny thing that happened. Short story. People saw that Daniel and his buds weren't bowing down to this pagan god. And they went and tattled on him. Here's grown men. And they're going, Nebuchadnezzar, he's not bowing down. And neither Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. No, that's unfair. You need to do something about that. So he calls them in. They get mad. Excuse me. They throw them into a fiery furnace. And if you haven't heard the story, you need to go read it. Jesus and or a heavenly being joins them in the furnace. They don't burn. The guys that throw them in the furnace gets burned. And God does this incredible thing. Also in chapter 6, verse 1 to 28, almost a repeat of the story, except this time it says this. it says the men who were around them got jealous of the fact that they were doing so well in the middle of the culture they were in. And so they said this, and this is what we read here in Daniel 6, 4, and 5. They began searching for their faults, referring to Daniel and them, and they finally threw up their hands because these guys were living with such integrity and doing everything with such excellence in the way that they did everything they did in life, which would include the way they thought about life, the way they did their jobs, the way they handled themselves in a culture situation. Excuse me. And they finally threw up their hands and they said this, the only way we're going to be able to get these guys is with their religion. And so they set up this thing, this system by which they would catch them in their religion. Excuse me. And the way it goes, that their jealousy started, and they caught them in their religion, and here's what ended up happening. They began searching for their faults. And they finally found a way to get at them, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But this is what I want you to get. This world is not going to like you. Jesus said you'll have trouble even if you are not hypocritical. Christ's call to you in this life is that you express His life in every single thing that you're doing. And that means you're going to do the right thing because Christ's life is spurring you on to do so. And here's what you're going to get from your trouble, Jesus says. You'll be taken advantage of. You'll be treated unfairly. You will not be understood. And here's the problem. There's a lot of people think that because I'm being good, good will happen to me. Get a real life. Yes, I will be blessed by God. Yes, He will create stability. Yes, He will hold me together. But it will not keep me from experiencing the hard things of this life. And there's often a time when it comes down where there's a clash of morality and there's a clash of how to do life that I will begin to pay the price. When I expect that I'm not going to have to pay because I follow Christ, the wave of things that comes at me from my culture and the negative messages that would come at me because I'm not doing life in a particular way makes a lot of people lose heart and not remain faithful. They just get tired of fighting. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Am I telling the truth about this? I am. It gets hard. It's very difficult. And many people go into the Christian life and they think, I've been good. I've been doing the right thing. How come I don't have the blessing of God? And how come I'm dealing with so much of this trouble? I'm telling you, do not be surprised. Be very realistic about what's coming rather than being reactive and just giving up. But there's another reaction people have. If they don't give up when the onslaught of that comes, a lot of people just get mad. They get very angry. Our being realistic and not being reactive can have an incredible impact around us. Nebuchadnezzar finally declared that God was the greatest God because of what happened from the delivery from the fiery furnace. They made it through the fire. I'm telling you that you will go through the fire in your life today. And as the brother said earlier in worship, Christ will go with us. And people will begin to notice that you're not consumed by the fire that you're experiencing in your life today, and they're going to start wondering, what in the world is going on? How did they make it through that thing that was so incredibly difficult? How did they not respond and try to pay people back in the middle of all that horrible, horrible difficulty that they just experienced? And it creates a chance to share the gospel about the one who has brought you through. My moral conduct gives me a place to share. Another key is this, that there's incredible power in refusing and not raging. Refusing and not raging. Daniel 5:17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to somewhere else. However, I'll be glad to read the inscription to you. What had happened is there had been a handwriting on the wall in public. Nobody could interpret what it said, and here's what ends up happening. They call Daniel in, and he's able to tell them what the handwriting on the wall is. But the king, thinking he was all amazing, says, Daniel, if you can read this inscription, I'm going to make you the third highest power in this country, in my kingdom, and I'm going to give you a gold chain. In other words, you're going to have everything that my kingdom has to offer. Daniel was sought after because the way he had lived his life in this culture. He lived with integrity in his reputation. And, excuse me, and because of that, he was called in to interpret this writing on the wall.
In the same way for us, there's this incredible thing that happens in our life when we allow Christ to influence us in such a dramatic way, especially when this culture starts to rage against us. But in the middle of all that, Daniel was offered another way other than the Lord's way. We often say that Jesus is the divine glue that holds the entire universe together, and especially the believer. And when I invite another way in, it's like a solvent in my life starts to come apart. Daniel refused what they had and what they were offering, because what they were offering was confidence, power, abundance, and his refusal was another way of saying, I already have all of that. I have everything I need. Your refusals in the middle of a culture, not saying I will not be pulled away by something else. And I'm not just talking one act of obedience, but anything that would distract you from your allegiance to Christ and your desire to go after Him and to run after Him. Whether it has to do with spending money or looking for another relationship or remaining in unforgiveness or taking revenge. All of those refusals keep you in a place where you can hear from the Lord and move in Him. But not only do they keep you in a place of faithfulness, they also give you a place of impact. Daniel maintained his power in life that was given him by the Lord. And he rose above his enemies with his integrity. And his refusals started a conversation. Why? Well, because who wouldn't take the third power? Who wouldn't want to be the third most powerful guy in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom? Who wouldn't want all that, everything that's offered by whatever it was that fellow was offering at the particular time? One of the things that happens in believers' lives is sometimes we see a different way of life that's offered, like a particular morality that's offered, like a particular way to handle my money, like a particular way to do relationships, to go about business, whatever all that is. We think about those kinds of things, and particularly if they're things that kind of disgust us. So I want you to do something for me. Get the most disgusting sin you can think of in your mind right now. When you got it, just slip your hand up. No hitting your wife or your husband or your friend. Okay, you got it in your mind? Now, that thing probably sets a rage off in you because it's sin. This is what I'm suggesting to you, that my refusals often lead me to some kind of moral outrage. But instead, even though I need to be mad at sin, what if instead, or in addition to that, it actually moved me to compassion? Now, I want you to take the moral outrage of your particular sin, the one that really bugs you the most, the one you go, oh, yuck, I would never do that. And I want to ask you this. What if instead of just being morally outraged about sin, what if instead of that you refused to continue in anger and you were angry but didn't sin, and instead let that moral outreach understand that the people that are caught in that particular sin are caught in a trap, and they need the compassion and the love of Christ to pull them out. And that you'd be willing to hang out with that person who has this moral sin that just makes you want to throw up, and you'd be willing to befriend them and care for them and to take the chance of presenting Christ to them. I wonder what the refusal to respond with disgust and instead respond with compassion would do to the culture that I'm involved in. I disagree with you. I'm sorry how you're doing. I'm sorry, I recognize there's this brokenness in your life, and I disagree with what you're doing, but I believe that there's another way, and finally, there's a last key. And the last key is this, that Daniel sought the Lord. In chapter 6, 1 to 28, you'll read the whole story, but 10 summarizes. He says this, now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, it was a document that said that no one was to worship anybody but Nebuchadnezzar. He entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had on the windows open toward Jerusalem. And catch this, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before God as he had been doing previously. Here's what I'd have you see. It's important that you see this. This guy, Daniel, was giving thanks to God. He was asking for God's favor. He was asking for the instruction of God in his life, in his words. He wanted to see, hear, and understand what the will of God was. As a matter of fact, it's interesting that Nebuchadnezzar finally said this, your God is the giver of mysteries. Well, what you see is Daniel understanding the guy that He recognized that God was the giver of mysteries. He was the giver of all wisdom and insight, like Nebuchadnezzar said. And he knew that he needed that again and again and again in the reality of his everyday living, moment by moment. What you see is the last key to remaining faithful is that you passionately pursue this Christ. And I'm not talking about let's all go mimic Daniel and make sure that we pray 3 times a day. Forget that. How about actually recognize that there's so much of my life that I turn to Christ in and I look for wisdom in Him then, that I can be identified as one who actually seeks the Lord for how I do things. Now, you want a little, way to judge that in your own life? How many people in your area or sphere of influence, and I'm not asking you if they know how many times a day you pray, know that a key portion, a key part of your life is that you pursue the living God and His wisdom in your life because you don't have a clue about what you're doing. Could you be indicted like Daniel? Because if you find yourself in a place where you're living this secret life, then the place of impact in your life as you're seeking the living God of this universe is having very little impact on the world. But for Daniel, he began to have an impact because he went into the den of lions. He was thrown in the dens of lions because he wouldn't bow the knee. And he came up, and catch this. After the lions didn't eat him, Nebuchadnezzar came over, had him take the rock off, and he's looking down in the pit, and he says, Daniel, Daniel, are you in there? And Daniel looks up, and he says this, long live the king. God's still delivering me. And by the way, king, I was never out to harm you. This is what I would close with. You want to know if you can have an impact on this world? When you seek the living God, He enables you to do things that you would normally not be able to do. Like to respond with compassion to a person that makes you want to throw up because of the way that they live their life. The living Christ can do that. The living Christ creates compassion in you for people who have offended you, who have taken advantage of you. All those people. The living Christ can do all that. And we see it present in Daniel's life because here he is, the God just threw him in to be eaten by a bunch of lions. And he's just been delivered from that thing. And he looks up and he says, bless you, King. What impact would it have on our culture if out of our faithfulness, out of our drawing from the source Jesus, they actually saw us begin to serve people who were taking advantage of us? I think Hagerstown would be radically transformed. Amen? So close with this. You got to be asking, where are you at with the keys? Because if you leave out the keys, I'm afraid you'll find yourself unfaithful. So this would be my challenge. I don't have time to go over the keys right now. I hope you got them the first time. I would ask if you find that some place, some part of those keys aren't in your life, that you find some believer and say, I need help. I need your community to encourage me to move on in what Christ has called us to impact this community.